Together, we've expanded creative horizons, amplified diverse voices, imagined new worlds, and discovered new dimensions. Pushed boundaries again and again. And we're only getting started. Thank you, creators. We can't wait to see what you make next.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this fantastic session. My name is Valerie Creighton. I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO at the Canada Media Fund. So today we're going to look at some issues around diversity and change and how leaders can affect change, and from an individual perspective, what you can do to influence a system, how we include a lot of elements in our society like reconciliation, guilt, and forgiveness, and maybe talk about some examples that are working really well. So to start off this conversation, I am very privileged and delighted that Tonya Williams has been able to join us. Tonya is an actor, and she's the founding and executive director of Reelworld Film Festival. In addition to many numerous awards, she's been a two-time Emmy nominated and two-time NAACP Image winner. So Tonya's joining us from Los Angeles today, where she lives. She's a Canadian. She's very active in the Canadian environment in terms of these issues, and has just completed a really interesting study through an organization she founded called Reelworld. So Tonya, I'm going to turn it over to you for about a few minutes to give us just a few highlights on what the study revealed. Over
Absolutely.
to you.
Plus, I have to just mention, since this is WIFT, that I got a WIFT Crystal Award.
Oh, even better.
You gotta give the props to WIFT. So thank you for that, Valerie. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to speak about something that I'm this passionate about. I think when you're a person of color, when you're Black, when you're Indigenous, certainly this is an issue that you live with through your whole life in every aspect of what you do and in the work that you do. And if you're in the screen-based industries, I'm sure you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody out there who's a Black, Indigenous, Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, Latinx person who does not have the same experience that I've had. And I started my career in the late 70s. And yes, there has been change, but we need more change. And we're hoping to push for more inclusivity and more diversity, not just talking about Canada, but because this is WIFT International, this has to happen in every single country, because the world has become that all the products that we make and the stories we create are being shown worldwide now. So we have to be cognizant of that. We were lucky that last year we were able to get some funding and do a study that had not been done before. It's hard to believe. There was no benchmark of knowing what people were thinking in terms of the community of people of color, what people were thinking, what they were doing, where they were. And just doing the study allowed us to understand how little data is being collected. And that's something that we want to look at. So I'm going to briefly, if anybody goes to reelworld.ca, they have to register and we send you a copy of the report we did. It's very extensive, but we want to do more of these, but we had to start somewhere. I think one of the things that came out in the report that was surprising to most people, not to me, but to most people, was how well educated our respondents were. That they had been trained, they had experience, but they were saying that they were facing barriers to employment based on discrimination and unconscious bias, and that had limited their access to professional networks. And as you know, this industry is very much on who you know, who you build relationships with. People hire from the circle that they know, that they understand, that they trust. So we're going to have to become very cognizant of how do we open up those networks? How do we create more inclusion just in the networking aspect of our industry? Then people also mentioned about how little data there was. So within the Black and Indigenous and people of color, the freelance, or whether you work in a broadcast or in a production company, better reporting is crucial. because it can result in more accurate understanding. And I know personally, and I've spoken to many people about this, we're getting a little nervous about this word BIPOC. It is a word that we're using quite a bit in Canada. They're using a bit in the United States. They're not really using it in Europe. But BIPOC becomes a difficulty because it could allow a community to hire one person and say they've hired a BIPOC person. So we need to unpack what BIPOC means. And for those of you who are international, it's a term that means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So they've tried to create a label that is easier within conversation, but we're nervous within the ease of that conversation that will actually lessen the amount of people we hire. No one can hire a BIPOC person. So you must always be thinking about not only in the hiring, but in the data you're collecting. Don't collect data that just says people of color or just says BIPOC. You have to break it down. We need to know how many Black people are in that data you're collecting. And data is also most important in the funding aspect. We need to know, how are the funds being distributed? Is it equitable to all races? And the only way we can know that is if each one of the government agencies that fund, each one of the production companies, the broadcasters, if they're keeping good records as to that data, then we'll know if things are improving or if they're not improving or if they're getting worse, which we hope that's not the case. There needs to be institutionalized change. I'll speak from the perspective of Canada. There is a misconception in Canada that slavery didn't exist. Well-educated people, including politicians in Canada, stand up and say, we don't have the problems they do in the United States and Canada. And that is so false. And that falsehood comes from, as Canadians, we've never acknowledged the slavery that exists there. The first recorded slave in Canada was actually in 1628. So as long as people have been enslaving Indigenous people in Canada is the same amount of time that they've been enslaving Black people. And those two races in particular have been struggling, but in the charter, in our government charter, we have acknowledged the racism, the discrimination, the enslavement of Indigenous people. And in our government charters, we have not recognized the enslavement and the institutional racism for Black people that have been in Canada. And because of that, we find that there is no earmarked funding. So that was part of the study as well, needing to create earmark funding for the different racial groups, not grouped together funding called BIPOC funding, but individual. And then understanding that the community is not doing anyone a favor when they create more inclusivity. They're not doing a favor to the people of color, to the Black people, to the Indigenous people, that this content is vital moving forward in the future, that the audience has changed. When you think of a worldwide audience, the majority are people of color. The majority are in the Black, the majority are Indigenous people. So you are actually creating content that is needed, that is wanted. And we have to, out of the study, people were also speaking about any content is not good. You want to make sure your content is reflective, that it of the community around you, reflective in a way that it's not stereotypical. Like all Black people are not slaves, you know, all Black people, you're not making content where all Black people are the subservient. We need to have content that shows people in very positive ways and reflective of positivity. And that will change when we can change leadership at the top. Currently in Canada, there are not Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color at the level of leadership that they can greenlight and fund projects. When we talk about institutionalized racism, we do not have casting directors. We don't have agents. We don't have managers. These are areas that we need to really be looking at, and part of the study speaks about that. And I'm really encouraged by what the UK, by what Australia, by what the US have been doing in terms of really hunkering down and trying to collect this data and using that data to make the change that they need to make.
Tonya, I just want to pick up a little bit on the comment you made about, it's been very interesting. I'm a white woman. I'm a woman of privilege. I've got a great job. I've always had access. I did live with an Indigenous man for over 20 years. So I was in a situation where I could begin to understand that whole world a lot better than I did before. But what I've noticed in a lot of the conversations since all of this has been happening is often the words that come up are, as you said, favor and help. And we want to bring these people to the table, which to me is really evidence of that kind of unconscious bias that we all learned in our language, because we don't have the history, we don't have the experience, and we really don't have the sensitivity. This isn't about helping. I mean, even in the call we had the other day with TIFF, with all of the leaders of the institutions, which was a good call, but the word from some of our major broadcasters came up twice, like, how can we help? Well, I don't know, from our perspective at the CMF, it's not about that. It's about something else. So I just thought that was a point that was really well taken. This is about something quite different than that approach.
No, absolutely.
So you have done this study and you've got it on your website, and you've been involved. The CMF has undertaken a process with Black leaders recently, and we'll be expanding that soon to all the different groups that Tonya mentioned in terms of other people of color communities in Canada. And we're looking at our own process. What are the next steps around not just this study, but as you see them?
You know what, there are so many different steps we can take, but I'm a big believer in, when you want to make change, you can get overwhelmed by thinking, how do I change the whole entire planet? How do I change my whole country? When I speak with people, and I'm invited often to speak on these things, I say, start right where you're standing. Stand in the office you are working in. Look around the office. Do you see all the colors of the rainbow of diversity reflected in your office? So before you start changing the world, maybe you can just start with the office that you actually work in and bring it to the attention. You'd be surprised how many people I just say that with, and while they're busy thinking, how can we change the whole system, they've not even started there. And they look around their own offices and realize, we do not have a reflection here. So, that is key. And I think when you come to the table listening, that's the other thing too, bring people of color together. Bring a Black, like, that's a wonderful thing that CMF has done. Bring Black people together to have the conversation. Really, it's about listening at this point. There's not going to be a quick fix. I know a lot of corporations they're trying not to look like they're racist by not doing anything. So they're trying to hurriedly come up with a quick fix or something that makes them look like we understand and we're with you and we're going to make changes right away. But that makes me nervous. Changes cannot happen in a quick way. It's taken hundreds of years to get us to this point. It might take us hundreds of years to get out of this point. Because, as you say, the systemic, the biases, the ones that are so ingrained in us that we don't even know we're racist when we try to help. So listening is a big part of this right now. We're going to have to listen to a lot of different voices. I'm one voice. My opinions do not mean that I have the solutions for all, like, say, Black people. You must listen to many, many different voices, and from that come up with a strategy. But some of the immediate things that can be done are look around your office, start hiring there, start bringing on more volunteers, start posting your jobs on different websites, different community sites, so you can reach a broader audience with the job posts that you're posting. As you know, we've just launched 3 weeks ago, accessreelworld.ca, and that is very specific database, a national Canadian database that is only for Black, Indigenous, Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, Latinx communities. And just in the 3 weeks, we've managed to get almost 400 people are registered there. We're setting a goal of trying to hit 500 every month, but already we're getting emails of people saying, thank you, Access Real World. We were able to find a cinematographer. We've been trying to look for people, or we were able to post our job there. So I think technology is going to move things along faster. We have access now to reach each other, and that's going to be great.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, with everything that's happened in the world around these issues, this is definitely the time, and technology affords us the opportunity to do so. And I'm glad to hear you say the issue of reactiveness, because I think you're right. People sometimes don't know what to do. And on many of the calls I've been on, all I hear are stats. We're going to have 25% of this and 50% of this and this and this. And that's great. And that's a very important part of it. But it seems to me there's a fundamental other approach and issue. And it is about listening. It's about learning. And then it is ultimately about change. Because if you don't know, if you don't listen, you don't know what to change. That's part of the reason why we did what we did.
Yeah. I've been in the business 45 years and I've heard those stats repeated over the many decades. What I'm interested now is if you say you're going to hire 40%, you're going to hire 40% what? You know, I want to hear the real strategy. Is it the lower entry level jobs? Are you actually going to try and change some of the leadership that you have? I think people now we're not going to just be accepting of just the carte blanche, X amount of percentage, whatever. I think we need to see the strategy. I think that's, you know, and I would rather wait 6 months for you to present me a strategy of, we have 120 leadership jobs currently, and we plan on hiring 50 people out of the Black and the Indigenous and people of color community to fill those jobs or to add to those jobs. I want real numbers, and I think we have to get very specific now.
Great. Okay. So I think we're going to now invite in the rest of our terrific panelists. And while they're brought into this conversation, I'm just going to briefly introduce them all. So today we have with us, we're very fortunate to have Dame Heather Rabbatts from Time's Up UK. So you all need to curtsy and acknowledge our wonderful Dame Heather that's with us. We have Lisa Meeches from Eagle Vision, Sandra Laronde from Red Sky Performance, a fabulous organization in Canada. And I'll just say I've been listening to a couple of the sessions Sandra has done online, and they've been really wonderful. Prem Gill, CEO at Creative BC out in Vancouver, and Matthijs, Wouter, Knol, head of the European film market. So we have a great international scope here. And I think to kick us off, I'm just going to say a couple of things that'll trigger your thinking as panelists. And then I'd like to, I'll prepare you, Dame Heather. I'd like to go to the UK first, because Prem and I were on a panel in, I think it was Berlin, and there's some incredible work that's being done in the UK, even through the BFI. I've forgotten the lady's name who's headed that up, but it was a role model for all of us. So we'll go to you first. But for all of you, I think some of the things we want to kind of focus on is, you know, how can powerful leaders make change? Again, not just the platitudes and this is what we're going to do, but what's really underneath. Change is hard, and it's really hard in a society that's been built the way all of our societies have been built. So how could powerful leaders make that change? How can you as an individual influence the existing system? Prem and I have had lots of conversations about that, and she said to me the other day, this is now my work. Like, this is my work as an individual in the position I'm in. How do you look at reconciliation? We had a Truth and Reconciliation panel in Canada. I think, Sandra, I listened into Senator Sinclair's session that you did, and I think that's been over for about 5 years now. And in spite of our government's grand claims about what they were going to do, not a damn thing has been done. So again, lots of talk, no action. But how do you think about reconciliation, guilt even, and forgiveness in the work that you do? And if any of you have any good examples of change in larger structures, I think that would be really useful for discussion as well. So I'm going to give you 3 to 4 minutes each. We're not pressured for time, but just in the scope so that we get everybody's views. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion for our audience that's listening in. I'd like to have a bit of discussion with the panelists, and I'll hopefully do a little wrap up at the end if I've had enough coffee. And I'm sorry I had to disappear. I forgot to unplug my landline. And that's all farm ranch business. I'm on my horse ranch in Saskatchewan. So that's off now, so we're good to go. So Dame Heather Rabbatts, over to you for your thoughts on these issues and your experience and anything you'd like to say.
A huge amount of what's been said already obviously chimes with our experience here. I chair Time's Up, as been mentioned in the UK, but sit on the global board. And we try and align our strategies because clearly in the film and the television business, we're talking about global businesses. So we have Netflix and Amazon and They're all based here, but many of those big decisions around structures get signed off in LA. So it's been really important for us to ensure that we've got a very good special relationship between both the US and ourselves. I think what we have been focused on for the last few years, and as you've mentioned, is trying to very much hone in on those structures, which if we can start to dismantle them, begin to create a shift in the balance of power. And I think, you know, power is a very important word that we need, I think, to constantly have in our framing of this conversation, because it is about actually changing the power structures. Our leadership here, in terms of across the broadcasters and the platforms, I never see another person of color, another Black person at the senior levels, never. And that has to fundamentally change. And so when we engage in these conversations, part of that is about actually some of the current people holding on to that power need to be creating the space and the room and to be stepping aside. And that is, you know, complicated. And I recognize it's complicated, but we have to start thinking about how those changes can be made. So one small example, we've been doing a lot of work with in the writers area, because we've had writers' rooms that have been white only, men only. We've got all the broadcasters, all the platforms now engaged in committing to commissioning people of color, women of color, Black women, in terms of now developing and writing new series. And one of the ways that it needs to be recognized in achieving that is actually, it means that when you get a very, you know, successful and recognized white writer, you don't necessarily commission him. Because if you keep commissioning, if you like, the usual suspects, you never create the room for the new voices. So there has to be a whole series of interventions which are shifting culture. And what we try and do is focus on all of the sort of key elements of the film ecology. So whether that's writers, whether it's directors, we know if you change the diversity of directors, you will start to have much more diverse crews. And as we've also been developing a Black list of cinematographers, editors, so that the broadcasters and the platforms say, well, we wanted to hire somebody, but we couldn't find anybody. Yeah. There is a real engagement. There's a real willingness, I think, now to have those conversations, which aren't just about platitudes, but are about literally how do you dismantle brick by brick the edifice so that we restructure this industry in a way that ensures that the stories we tell are absolutely from the community in which we all know and we are all part of.
You know, we, a few years ago at the CMF, I brought all the federal agencies into the room to talk about some of the issues that had been raised from our Indigenous community in the sector, which led ultimately to the establishment of Canada's first Indigenous Screen Office. And I remember really well listening to all the points of resistance about why we couldn't do things. We all, you know, they all, NFB, Telefilm, CTF, everybody, broadcasters had programs, and then they were all eliminated. And as I listened to that at the end, I said, you know, it's a very difficult thing to say it's all gone and Indigenous people can just come to the regular programs, which doesn't really work. But the real people who are missing out when we don't have those stories accessible is the public and the audience. So that's who's missing. You know, we're missing a whole community of incredible storytellers and wonderful stories that the people of our country and the world don't have access to, and that has to shift. Okay, so let's jump, we're gonna jump back and forth across the Atlantic if everybody's okay. So let's go to Prem, who's been thinking about these issues widely and deeply. Prem, what are your thoughts on some of these topics?
Thank you, Val, and everybody for inviting me. And I'm already learning so much and also nodding my head a lot with both Tonya and Heather. You know, Tonya, you and I met in 2001 at an event that was called the Colloquium for Cultural Diversity in Canadian Media. So I feel like, you know, we have often Canada is seen as a place that is so multicultural and diverse. And Matthijs, I think we had this conversation when we met in Berlin, is that because we present ourselves to the world in a certain way, it is assumed that we don't have these kinds of challenges and problems here, and we certainly do, and they've been, you know, brought to light over the years, but there's certainly a different type of focus. And despite the horrific circumstances that this has all happened under, I'm so grateful that that has happened. So yes, it's been my life's work, and it will continue to be. And like Heather, I have, you know, since post-COVID, we've had, or during this COVID period, we've been having Canadian media leaders, industry leaders meetings of up to 30, sometimes 50 people. And I'm the only person of color in Canada on those calls. There are, you know, 2 Indigenous people who lead the Indigenous Screen Office, to my awareness. And, you know, that within itself is problematic. And there's something about the Zoom world that actually intensified it for me personally in a different way, where you see a sea of faces, very different. You know, you always think about it as a person of color walking into a room, but actually presented with it, it's been a very different, or an evolution for many of us. So, you know, how can leaders affect change? Well, it's not being shy to have the conversations. And again, as a South Asian person whose family settled here in Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people here in Vancouver in the mid-1960s, you know, we're still visitors to this land, but we also came from a country, we went from India to the UK to Canada. So it's in my DNA as well, being complicit and adjacent to colonial structures and reinforcing them. And that's the structures that we all know how to work within. And being really mindful right now of not recreating those in a different way. And there's been a lot of great work that's happening across, certainly across our country and around the world, but some of the work that is happening that is often centered in a place like Toronto, like the panel that Tiff did last week, which is great and informative, but it does come from a very central Canada perspective. You know, there's Lisa's in Winnipeg, I'm in Vancouver, there's a lot happening across this country. So as leaders, we cannot, there's not going to be one solution. It's not going to be just one trigger of we've created a fund and now we've solved the problems. We've seen those kind of programs come and go, by the way, in Canada. I've run some of those programs in Canada. And when the regulatory obligations fade out, the programs go away. And you're not left with a lot. So, you know, there is, I think, recognizing the complicitness that we all have in the structures and the system, what voices we bring to the table. And certainly, and Valerie and I have had very honest conversations in the last 5-6 weeks, is also, you know, the fear of repercussions personally has to, like, for once and for all, like, doesn't matter anymore. And I think that is something that maybe where there's certainly, I think, a shift around leadership. So, you know, I would just say that there's a lot of people in Canada that have stepped up, are willing to do the long-term work, recognizing the importance of reconciliation as part of that work has to be in parallel. I've always said all of these things have to happen in parallel. When we're focused on just gender issues, sometimes I just stepped away from those because it was not focused on Indigenous women or women of color in this country. So those are, you know, now it's going to be, like you said, Tonya, the next, you know, several decades, certainly for some of us, of, you know, just continuing to be relentless.
You know, Prem, I found it really interesting when we were talking, the point that you raised about partly, you know, fear of being punished for speaking out. But the other comment you made that I hadn't even thought about was how, as a young woman growing up in those circumstances, you were encouraged by your parents and the whole society not to be different, not to speak out, to meld in, to try to make sure the feathers weren't ruffled. And I would say, if I'm not putting words in your voice, but those days are kind of over for you. And this is the time where all of that can kind of be at least set aside as the really important issues come forward. But I found that a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think particularly growing up South Asian in Canada comes with other, you know, you come from a country that was, you know, very, you know, colonized very clearly. And there's so many, and then also being, you know, I have a white adjacency that I don't think Black people in Canada necessarily do, or Indigenous people. And that comes with a level of privilege. So it's the recognition of all of that. And the honesty that I think as leaders is critically important. But until we do see the leadership in organizations around the world shift from the performative to the transformative, and actually have the positions of power occupied by, you know, more people who are not white,
Yeah,
that's when we will see shift.
exactly.
Okay. Sandra, can we go to you now? Because you've got a great organization that's doing some tremendous work in the country. Could you weigh in on some of these ideas and thoughts and anything you'd like to offer? Your mic is still, you're still on mute. Regina, can you fix the mic, or can Sandra, there we go. I think you're good. Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me here today. And I'm here on Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of New Credit territory. And I myself, I'm Mi'kmaq Anishinaabe, a person of the deep water in Temagami, Northern Ontario. I would definitely, first of all, concur that we have inherited a colonial paradigm, a colonial structure. And to this day, it is in full operation. And what are the ways that we can dismantle that or shift that is something that's really important. And for our viewers from overseas, to put it in context, in Canada, Indigenous people didn't even have the right to vote federally in Canada until 1960. So I think sometimes we always forget how close that really is. Like, it's within our, pretty much our generation, more or less. So it's very recent. And so when I think about systemic change, I think about the ecology as well. I think about the leadership. I think about the positions of power within boards, or, you know, higher positions and even middle positions. I think that we definitely are not visible in those areas in Canada as yet. We will be. I also think about our stories in terms of content, who gets to tell our stories, and how our stories are told, and who's writing those stories, whose gaze is behind the camera on those stories, because the whole visual world is a story in itself as well. And then, of course, who gets to perform in those stories as well, and direct, of course, and produce are very important positions. You know, when I think about women in positions of power, I wonder how we can do things differently than they are. I wonder how Indigenous knowledge can even inform how we as women do things differently and in positions of power. I think about, you know, our visioning of being, thinking of 7 generations thinking. So really thinking 7 generations into the future. I think about how do we embed value-centered ideas and content, and that's meaningful and transformative. And how do we even plant seeds now that we know that necessarily we're not even going to necessarily enjoy the fruits of those plants in our lifetime? So how can the thinking be longer term? Because that is definitely within colonial structures. It's not thinking long term. And we are definitely on the margins as Indigenous peoples, peoples of color, as Black people, and as women too. We're on the margins. And then how can we drive, as Indigenous people, our narrative into the center of Canada's DNA? That we are not a distant cousin of Canada. We deserve to be right firmly entrenched, embedded, and a lot of content in Canada's narrative. And Canada will only gain by that narrative, because the content is so rich and diverse and beautiful and necessary. And necessary not only for people, but for the environment, for children, for future generations. So it's not even just thinking about people when we think about leadership, it's about all of creation. Because all of our teachings are about not being here to dominate, but to be here understanding that we are in this relationship. It's all about being in a web of complex relationships. That's what we have to understand, and not necessarily a patriarchal need to dominate everything. I'll just stop there for now.
Sure. And I think the one point that I really value that you raised was about children and teaching and future generations. Because if we don't do that, everything that is there just perpetuates. And I think, Heather, you said something about, if there's a white writer that's successful, you might not want to hire that person, because people work with who they know. They work with their past experience. They just turn the same people over and over again. So the whole point, and as Tonya said, it's not that the people of color and Black and Indigenous people and people from South Asian communities and others are not out there. They're out there and they have experience. They just don't have the access points quite often. And so these databases are really critical for that. But it's also how we collectively look at these issues as these young kids are in school and as they come into the system and as they start to think about things differently. I've certainly noticed that in my own family. Mm-hmm. Okay, Matthijs, we're going to go back across the ocean and hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me in this illustrious round. I represent the European film market, and we've actually been working, I've been a part of that, in making sure that we started paying attention to not only how the market is organized or who's attending, but also the way people consider doing their business, the way they become aware actually of the fact that decisions within the film industry are taken by a very limited group of people within the industry. Something that I think 5 years ago in Europe has been something that was never mentioned anywhere. And I must admit that at the beginning it was quite a strange topic for myself, because I was not very familiar with it. I'm very privileged, white, cisgender, gay man living in Europe, having all the opportunities that I wanted to have and so on. So when people approach me with that, I felt like, yeah, well, that's great, but why has this to be within a market structure, and can't it be in a conference program or something where we talk about how to make the film industry more inclusive, but not really specifically looking on the way business is being done. And I must admit that I completely changed my view on it after having had a couple of experiences and also seeing that actually when you talk about how new and different stories are being included in the industry, if you look at how they are being made, how they're being developed, who is actually allowing things to be made and developed, and how audiences actually are, as Tonya also said in the beginning of her talk, if you look at who is actually meant to see all that content that we'd like to make, we're not talking about a huge group of white people. We're talking about a much larger group that actually has not so much content in which they see themselves reflected or with which they could identify and to a certain level. So I think by changing and implementing that in the market, that actually made, first of all, the job much more fun, but also I thought, and I saw that in my team, it created a lot of ideas after a while of how we could actually contribute to that changing. It's been going in very small steps, but I think in the meantime, and I'm quite proud of it, that in the meantime with a team that we have in Berlin, we've become quite aware when we take decisions and saying, okay, where can we do that in a different way as we used to do it before? That means that we have organized, yes, we did organize conference programs. We've been looking into the people we'd like to hire. We've been looking into the people we'd like to give easier access to the market, because before it might have been difficult for them to attend the market. And these have all been very many steps, I would say, but it certainly has shown within the European film market that there's a gradual, slow, sometimes you would wish it would go faster, but we see changes happening a little bit. And even though I realize a lot that it's just a slight beginning, but it's certainly more worth it. And I must say, I mean, even being in this round today and meeting people that I have met in the past couple of years, just because me and a couple of my colleagues started thinking about it or became aware or were actually addressed and asked why we didn't do anything before, has made working, I think, in the industry much more interesting. And yeah, it gives also ideas about what we still have to do in the future. So you said in the beginning when you introduced this round, like where could we start? And changing the world is always a great thing when you wake up, but as soon as you've had breakfast, you realize that actually it's really a lot to do. So I think to start on the working or in the environment in which you work yourself, that's a good start. And yeah, then you can hopefully make steps ahead. That's what I hope to do as well.
Yeah, I think your point on access to those markets is really important, because often people from these communities, they have trouble just accessing those markets and paying the fees. And a lot of the markets around the world have been quite exclusionary in nature and very expensive. And I'll use just a bit of a different example. You know, the Venice Film Festival is fabulous, but it's been a highly elitist organization for many years. And about 5 years ago, they started to bring VR into that market, which was a huge shift in thinking and change. It's not about this issue, but it's just about different genres of technology. And then they ended up putting all the VR people on an island where they used to put the lepers. And I said, well, that's kind of like, you know, VR is kind of the leper, traditional, conventional media making. So maybe that's an appropriate thing. But I think access to those markets, and not just access, but how those markets can seem to be of interest to people who've never had the chance to engage in that kind of business, B2B marketing before, will be a challenge, because it's not just about opening the door, it's about how do people feel comfortable in that environment and welcomed into that environment and become a part of it, not, as somebody said, the second cousin, I think you said, Sandra, to the whole Canadian society. And we've certainly seen a bit of that in Canada. And Tonya's festival and many others for people of color and BIPOC, sorry about the word, but it's still kind of in our language at the moment. And Tonya's festival is quite specific to Black people, and I think people of color too, but that is starting to change. So thank you, great. Okay, Lisa, it's up to you to take us home. And I know you have quite an interesting perspective on this. We've talked about it many times, and you were on the BAMF panel with me when we spoke. So over to you, Lisa. Your mic is on mute still, Lisa. If you can get, your mic is on mute. Can you get?
There we go.
Okay,
can you hear me now?
Perfect, got it.
Okay, well, thank you. Pindiga Shikwadishna Kosmakinapturam, Portage La Prairie, Treaty 1 and Dunji. So I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge the traditional territory where I'm doing this call from. It's Treaty 1 territory just outside of Portage. This is a place of my ancestors. And you know what, after listening to everybody, I think we're all on the same page. I think we're all go-getters, movers and shakers. You know, and I followed everyone's careers to a certain degree. And I think that how this story is going to unfold is part of our healing journey as the storytelling nation. We're advocating and making change in the policy world, as well as in front of the screen, and what that's going to look like in terms of tax credits and benefits packages coming from the broadcasters. That's all fine and dandy, but I think Tonya's nailed it on the head when she spoke about making the changes in our home territories, in our home offices. I think that's where it begins. And ensuring that the Vals of the world, as well as CMPAs of the world, have everything they need to create a good business case moving forward. So the rest of us, because I still am responsible for the content delivery of my own projects, right? But also, I really like what was said about. I really like what was said about keeping the testimonials and outcomes out there. I think Tonya's onto something with that. I find that those types of manifestations of the outcomes are really important when you're looking for partners and access for dollars. Also, Jesse Wente's Indigenous Screen Office, that whole idea, that whole concept was amazing. I always rely on this book, the Protocols and Pathways book from the Indigenous Screen Office. And just last week when we were negotiating broadcast agreement, that book really came in handy, because they were trying to take the easy way out and consult with us in past development. And so this book of best practices actually work to our benefit. And so I wanna send out the accolades to each of you on this panel that are doing really well and making changes and policy changes, because this needed to happen a long time ago. And I think it was Sandra, you said something about, you know, just making sure that the content and editorial control is in the right hands. I, for one, believe in strong succession planning and building up from the grassroots. With the NSI, the National Screen Institute New Voices program, and the Indigidocs program, we've been able to graduate over 150 young Indigenous filmmakers that are still working in our industry. So it's going to be a culmination and you know, continued discussions like this. But at the same time, we know we're part of this melting pot that we call Canadian production. And there's nothing wrong with honoring our uniqueness and keeping our storytellers strong and abundant with the resources that they need to tell their stories. Eagle Vision, which is, I'm a partner in, we developed this program called Building Bridges, where you would take someone like a seasoned non-Indigenous professional and train them with a young Indigenous up-and-coming filmmaker, and throughout their lifetime, and it works well with series, especially with series work, that they learn together about the process of the culture and then the filmmaking process. So everybody learns in that. And we've adopted a model, which I think, Sandra, you'll be familiar with, and it's called a Sundance Lodge model, where we train for every key position at a Sundance ceremony for people to be trained. And Eagle Vision runs the same ideology and worldview as the Sundance Lodge. So for each key position, that is, you have 4 people being trained, and we work with the unions in the industry to make sure that they understand this model. So every Indigenous producer will introduce something like that, that is deemed their best practice. And so I think that's really, really important. But one of the other things that I find really helpful as a decision maker is being able to take a step back and fill out my own report card, and also the industry's report card. And I believe at this point we'd all be failing. We've done a lot of work as an industry, as a women nation. We've done a lot of work keeping balance in there, because we also want to leave our men behind, right? In order for us to find balance, we don't want to leave one gender behind. That's not how this works. That's not how you create balance in life, by excluding one nation. And for the men nation and the women nation and the storytelling nation, we need to find that balance somehow. And that's going to be our story, our healing story as a human race in this industry. This is how we're going to do this together. And I'm so proud of each of you for bringing these discussions to the forefront, and not being afraid to talk about these difficult situations and circumstances that we have to find solutions for, because that's what we do as producers. We find solutions for every problem, right? And so we're on to something big. We're on to something very hopeful. I mean, if you look at the list, for example, the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, the TRC's calls for justice, the Missing and Murdered Inquiries report calls for action. All of those things are doing nothing but creating dust, and we as an industry have to start implementing you know, those calls to action and calls for justice, whether we do it in-house, like Tonya said, or we do it nationally. But if we got to quit talking about this, because I'm getting older, boys and girls, and you know, now is the time. Like we're seeing a paradigm shift during this COVID, right? During the lockdown, worldwide shift, and we either welcome it or become afraid of it. And I'm welcoming it. I love the position that we're in because this is the time for change. This is the time to honor uniqueness. This is the time to listen to the storytellers. This is going to be such a magical time. In 5 years and 10 years down the road, we're going to have an abundance of stories and survival stories. So something like this needs to happen, that needs to bring us back to the land, back to check and balance, back to being human beings again. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So this discussion and these types of discussions couldn't happen at a better time in our human existence, because, and Val knows, and Sandra knows this as well, that I've always been a kind of spirit-based person. I was going back to the land to find solutions and being a good listener, but at the same time, being able to wear my linear hat and circular hat when I need to. And that's how we run the company. And that's what we bring to the policy table. So for example, when I talk about making those policy changes, I served on the tax credit, Manitoba Tax Credit Board here. And about 15 years ago, we had our elders who provide elderly input and advice on productions deemed a tax credit. And so it's going to be those kind of changes and collective changes, whether it's negotiating with the unions to move our people up the union ladder, and then finding a comfortable zone so that nobody feels excluded or angry. But just talking about that, it's never going to be a perfect world. We know that. And carrying a bit of that anger is a good thing, because it's going to be a reminder of where we come from. It's never going to go away. We know that. Our young people coming up the ranks in this industry are going to still carry that fire in their belly. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's going to be what drives us to equality and balance. Now, we might not see it in our lifetime, but a lot has happened. I mean, we went from being analog to a digital, industry. I never thought I would see that, or working from home. I always thought I'd be an office person, but I'm liking this, and I know that you are too, Val.
Yeah, I am indeed. So I just have you touched on something that I think is a difficult conversation a bit, but I think it's an important part of the conversation. And you talked a little bit, Lisa, about, it's hard for people to kind of face what's going on and the difficulties around that. And I'd be very interested to hear from any of you, or all of you. There's been so much really ugly backlash to so much of this. And do you have any thoughts or advice on how, how you can handle that and how you can manage that? Because it's always part, anytime there's change, people resist. Anytime power is perceived or threatened to be taken away, people resist. But some of the backlash has been so ugly. I know Prem and I talked about this a little bit, and you just, like, I've shut down news feeds, and especially those from the US, because I don't want that kind of energy around me. But do you have any thoughts, or what's your experience been? Or Helen, from the UK perspective, I'm not as familiar with Heather, with what's been going on there. And Matthijs, any thoughts on the whole managing of the backlash question?
Well,
Heather,
I think it's important not to be consumed by that negative energy.
Yeah,
I think it's all about how we stand the ground and how we build our alliances, and that is crucial, so that none of us feel alone in terms of dealing with that backlash. I think in some ways dealing with the obvious comments is slightly easier than the backlash that is that passive aggressive stance that you find, where the language is all the language of liberalism and of acceptance, but actually it is about shoring up current practices. Right. And that is, that's harder to get to, and that requires a level of persistence and argument when those people really wear us all down and they take our energy away. So I think it's being very mindful about it. I think it's about being very clear about how we're building allies with other Black colleagues, and indeed with white colleagues, to ensure that there is a sense of a voice where you might try and shoot one of us down, but standing alongside of me are literally hundreds of others. And I think you know, we all know that we stand here today on the shoulders of our ancestors who have gone before us, and that is, you know, that is our debt. That is what our responsibility to continue to shape and push this narrative. I think the one thing I wanted just to add is that we know that COVID, you know, the people who are going to suffer the most are going to be the poorest, the most disadvantaged, Black people, people of colour. And whilst this is an opportunity for us to strategically realign, I think we have to be really mindful about the very difficult circumstances so that so many of our communities are going to be facing and dealing with, and that we should never forget that.
Anyone else want to weigh in on not just that question, but anything else that you want to speak about? This is the time when we can have a bit of a discussion. I'm getting a bit conscious of time, but I think we're okay. And then I'll do a little wrap up for us. Matthijs, jump in and then talk.
I'll go after Matthijs.
Okay.
That Heather just said, which is, I think apart from forming alliances, so we're not alone in dealing with criticism, it's also the sheer fact what we're doing right now, and we should continue doing that, is making this a topic, making speaking out about this, making sure people can actually relate to it, talk about it, take it as a reason to discuss it with their own colleagues or friends. And I think that's also something that at least I see and feel changing. As said, being a relative newcomer in this area, I would say, since a couple of years, but I feel that because it's being spoken out more, I feel it in the own organization that I work in, and I see the differences with 2 years ago, where when these topics are addressed, people don't frown or think like, what is he talking about, or what is she talking about? And that is already quite a change, a little one, but something that's important, I think, to make a change happen. So alliances, yes, and making sure that things are on the agenda and being shared.
Right. Tonya?
Because we're going through such an interesting time, I sometimes have sympathy for the white people within the organizations, for Black people and Indigenous people and all other people of color, because right now, from a white perspective, I feel their guilt of what is happening has made them also ultra sensitive. So when they're hearing the criticism, and everyone communicates differently, so some people are communicating in a calmer way, and some people are getting heated and angry, some people of color. So I see white people, sometimes the shutdown happens because they're taking it so personally, like, you are blaming me for what is happening. And I think in your question, when you said about guilt and reconciliation, one of the key things I think the white community can do right now is do not take anything personally. Nothing is, you were not there doing this for the last 400 years. You are, but you have to understand that for Black people and Indigenous people and people of color, we've been told for the last few decades, I've been told in my 45 years that the things that I am expressing or that I'm noticing, that I'm overreacting, that they're not really there, that this racism isn't there. So that anger can build up, but we're just asking, you're basically just allow people the platform to vent, and you don't have to apologize on behalf of the white race, and you don't have to come up with a solution either. It's just about allowing people to just vent things that they've been, the frustrations they've felt for a long time, what they're thinking and feeling. It's sort of the old adage of, you know, I can't remember if men are from Venus, women from Mars, that whole thing, where women would talk about men always wanting to fix their problems, that really they just wanted to share with their, you know, significant other, this is an issue I have, but you don't have to fix it. I think right now we're just at the stage, we want you to hear, we want you to understand, and that you can even say, I hear and I don't understand yet. Tell me more. I am open to it. I want to understand your experience. So that was something I wanted to say within, and understand also the uncomfortability and nervousness of people of color who feel they cannot fail. That is a privilege they feel white people have always had. You can fail 1,000,000 times, the door is open. We've been taught by our parents, we've been taught by society, you get one shot.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you fail at your one shot, not only will you never get another shot, but you've probably ruined it for every other race, you know, of color. So we carry that with us. I have to let that go a lot of times and shake it out. Every time I do a character, those questions come up. You know, what does your initiative or your character or whatever it is you're doing, how does that speak to the Black population? And I'm like, no one white gets asked those questions. Like, you
Heavy
get
burden.
and move on.
Okay, we're going to stop there if you're all comfortable. I think we started with Tonya, and that was a great summary about many of the issues, and I'm just going to give us a little overview. So what I've heard you say today, and I hope I listened as closely as I could, is that change is certainly upon us, whether we're ready or not. We've inherited a colonial mindset, structures, and bias right around the world. Systemic racism requires systemic change. There has to be a shift in power. Power is a really key word, and decision-making. Dismantling of these colonial structures, not all at once. It will take time. We have to work together, both the white communities and all the people of color communities, to dismantle brick by brick. There isn't just one solution, but certainly a societal shift in thinking from a dominance and patriarchal control has to end. The world is a big place, and our view could, should, and will be more holistic. We need to plant the seeds now that may not mature for many generations, but we have to start somewhere. Moving towards the content and storytelling and making sure that that storytelling is in authentic hands. The old adage, nothing about us without us. Some good examples were Time's Up in the UK, where broadcasters and platforms have committed to creating room and space for new voices. That's a start. The NSI training programs in Canada and the Sundance Lodge model that Lisa referred to in terms of training from the heart. So really, it's about starting from where you stand, building alliances. Get back to the land. That's a privilege I've had. Get your bloody feet into the dirt and get back to being human. There is a paradigm shift going on. The world is moving closely, and now is the time. And you white people out there, don't take anything personal. Change is hard, and it's all good for all of us. So I want to thank our audience that's with us today. We hope you got some real good insight and value from this discussion. And I particularly want to thank all of these incredibly interesting and brilliant, intelligent thinkers on this panel. And my God, I hope we can get together one of these days for a glass of wine. So thanks to WIFT for allowing us to have this conversation, Helen and all your team, and Regina for keeping us technically safe. And bye, everybody. Hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much.